Hey guys, it's Daniel. The following is my interview with Allison Chain's engineer, Jonathan Plum, where he talks about what Layne Staley was like, how certain songs and records were made, what the relationships were like between different band members over the years, and more.
With Toby Wright at London Bridge for Jar of Flies, we would record instrumentals, and then somehow Layne was getting a recording of that, and then he'd go home on his 4-track and build up vocal ideas with harmonies and everything. So he'd show up, he'd come in with his little 4-track, we'd plug it in, he'd play us his ideas, and it already had harmonies and everything. So I think Layne wrote all his own lyrics and own melodies at that point. So what Layne would do is he'd sing Lee's vocal, and then he'd say, I have a harmony. And then, Toby would make a new track, and Layne would sing the harmony. And then he'd say, I have another harmony. Layne would say, give me another track. And he'd do a third part. And then Toby would say, Layne, is there one more harmony? Layne would kind of think and say, roll the tape. And he would find that one weird fucked up harmony that makes it like, you probably was like a seventh, if you usually harmonies, it's like you got the root, the third and the fifth. And then he was probably adding a seventh or something twisted. And it was like Toby pushing him to like dig for like a weirder harmony. So a lot of that, I feel like when you listen to Jar of Flies, it's very layered with Layne. And a lot of it wasn't super thought out. It was just like on the fly, like he sang, he added a harmony, added a harmony, it was done. Where I feel like, usually in the studio, we can like labor over harmonies forever. Like, oh, there's a note, go up one step or go down a half step. But they just did it. It was just right on the fly. My impression was that by the time Jar of Flies was happening, Layne was much more involved in writing his own parts and his own lyrics as well. Again, I don't know for sure, but that was my impression. I sensed that Layne wanted to be more involved, maybe needed to be more involved, and Jerry maybe was like intentionally backing off and giving him space to do some of that stuff. I think to me, the big thing with a lot of the songs on that record is the vocals and how layered they are. The story there was that Layne would go in and he had already like had some harmonies set, like, cause he'd bring in these cassette demos that had almost 3 parts through like the entire song, which kind of was new. I felt like I hadn't heard Alice do that before. It was usually kind of Layne and Jerry. I don't think Jerry hardly sang any harmonies. It was all Layne. My sense was that this was Layne's sort of time. I don't know of his first time, but it was like he kind of had this new space to like write his own stuff. And he did seem excited about that. And I sensed it was he hadn't either ever done that before or like Jerry didn't give him the space to do that. And I don't know if that's accurate or not, but my sense was Layne was really proud of this stuff. And so, like I said, he would take these demos home. So again, Jerry would just pick up a guitar and strum this riff and create a structure, but it didn't have any melody. It was just a cool guitar riff. And he would send it home with Layne, and Layne would show up the next day or the day after that with the sketch of his lyrics. So yeah, I got the sense that Layne went home and just really, wrote this heartfelt music, heartfelt lyrics juxtaposed to what Jerry was giving him, But at the time, I don't remember us analyzing it. It was just like, this is what Layne wrote, he's expressing himself, and that's what it is. And again, like on those recordings, Layne did his vocals like that. Like they were all one take. And if they weren't, if Toby asked him to redo something, he would get really pissed about it. Like, yeah, he would practically say no. And I remember Toby sweating it because he'd have to weigh this decision. Like, I know that could be better. Is it worth asking him and putting him in a worse mood,
You mentioned before that Layne was very chill in the studio. I guess that changed by Jar of Flies?
That brings up a good point. Thanks for pointing that out. So I think when he wasn't recording, when he was just hanging, he was really relaxed. But in the studio was like a whole different thing. When Layne was on mic, it was super intense. And I felt like earlier on when we were working with Rick, Layne was, it wasn't quite as intense. I think I told this story before where Layne would struggled with a vocal part and he was getting really frustrated. This is when Rick was producing, and Rick could give him direction and say, let's sing it again. And it was a ballad off of SAP. And I remember he had to sing it over and over again. And I remember thinking, this is Layne Staley. Why is he struggling with this? And Rick had to explain to me that Layne is incredible at the yelling stuff, but the softer stuff he struggles with. So I remember Rick easily giving him direction and like, no, try this, sing this over. And he went with it. But, skip forward a few years when he was now working with Toby, it was different. Like you couldn't direct Layne. He went in, he sang his part, And if Toby like asked him to do something again, he maybe did it a couple times and he was pissed about it. What he would do is he would go in the big room. At this time, I remember Layne was out in the main room. We got a vocal booth that he did a lot of stuff in, but this particular day with Toby, he was out in the big room. He'd go do his vocals. He'd come in and he'd sit on the couch and he would just close his eyes and listen. And I think soon as like he heard it once and he'd say, "That's it." And Toby would be like, "Yeah, that's really good." And he'd just walk out and that was it. And he was gone. So I barely remembering. It's almost like he didn't want to be in the control room. And it's almost like then he didn't even want to be singing. It was like he kind of seemed pissed to have to be there. And obviously, like, I have no idea what his headspace was like because he delivered these incredible performances. But from my impression, like he didn't want to be there. And so maybe the intensity of him and Jerry and the fumes of these relationships and being in a band and the intensity of people just dealing with each other and getting the creative, getting through the creative process together, maybe not always agreeing. I got the sense Layne just didn't want a part of it. Like he didn't want to fight. He just wanted to get in, do his vocal parts and take off.
So in general, from your experience working with Allison Chains, were there any particular microphones that Layne preferred using, or was he not picky?
I would say on the gear wise, and you're asking if Layne had any specific, my impression was Layne, and I think everybody sort of knows this, the history was sort of Jerry was really like the overseer of everything of Allison Chains in general, was kind of the main creative force from my perspective of when they came in the studio. It was like really Jerry was kind of overseeing everything, and Layne would really just come into the studio when he was needed. He typically just hung out on the couch. Either he just wasn't there or he'd be hanging out on the couch watching cartoons and eating cereal, and generally stayed out of like Jerry's way during most of the creative process. So it just seemed like, okay, now it's time for vocals, bring Layne in. That's what it seemed like from my end. So Layne would just come in and we'd have the mic set up. There was no comments or, Layne just went into the booth and started singing. So I feel like he had no specific, care or interest in what he was singing in. Some artists are particular about that. Many experienced artists will come in and say, well, I'd like this microphone or whatever. But I'd say for the most part, artists leave it up to us to decide what's best. Maybe to jump forward now. So with Toby Wright on Jar of Flies and the later stuff, what Toby did was we were in Seattle, right? So there's not a lot of resources in Seattle as far as the music business is concerned. So he rented a whole bunch of like really high-end boutique microphones from LA. So there's companies in LA that will rent you like precious and one-of-a-kind microphones. And he rented probably like 3 or 4 different like really boutique vintage microphones. Like he would have had a 47 FET, a tube one. He would have had a U67, which is a tube also. And I can't remember what else, but there was like a handful of really nice. And so what we did is we set up 4 or 5 different microphones and quickly had Layne come in and sing a little bit on each microphone and just reviewed what sounded best. And gosh, I want to say it might have been the U47 that we used for Jar of Flies and later, but it was definitely one of the vintage ones. And it was definitely a tube mic. And I do remember specifically at that point, we were running through an LA2A compressor, which I think we had rented for that as well. And I know we talked about this before, that we were getting distortion probably off the compressor or the tube microphone, because his volume, was just so massive. I do love this story. And this was early. This was with SAP. In fact, this is the first time I worked with Layne. Facelift was like my favorite record. And, I knew him as a screamer, but that particular day we were doing something off of SAP and he was singing really quietly and he was struggling with it, like we were talking about earlier. And I remember it sounded really great, but I really wanted to hear Layne do the Layne thing. He wasn't doing the Layne thing. I was kind of disappointed not to get to hear that in the studio. That, this is again, the first time I'd worked with him, and he was really struggling with this part. And he came out of the booth and I remember he just was pissed and he yelled, "Fuck." It's like, "Fuck." But that was the Layne scream. That's the first time I heard that. I know I've told you the story before, but it is pretty fun. And it was, that's a great story, man. To hear it, like, it was like 5 feet away from me. It was like, whoa, there it is. That's the Layne. And then later, I did get to hear him sing it in the studio, actually sing that full voice thing. And he was just incredible.
So I want to go back to Jar of Flies for a moment. You mentioned once to me before that during the making of I Stay Away, Layne's vocals were so loud the recording started clipping. What exactly happened there?
I remember it was just Toby, the producer, and me. It was just the two of us in the control room. I think Toby and I both felt nervous because Layne was so edgy And he sang, and it started out soft, and then at one point he starts really digging in and getting loud, and it's clipping all over the place. It's like there's a compressor that's plugged in, that's overdriving, and I can look at the level on tape, and these VU meters you can see, and it was pegged. It was past zero, and technically as an engineer you don't want that. It was like improper recording technique. And the song got done, and I remember telling Toby, like, dude, that totally clipped. And Toby was like, it was awesome. We're keeping it. And I remember at the time thinking, like, yikes, like, how are we going to deal with this distortion thing? It seemed like really improper to me, or just from what I knew at that point, you just kind of like couldn't do that. You had to redo it. But Toby was like, we're keeping it. And it's on the recording. If you listen to it, it's distorted. And it's great. It's like, it's funny now because I hear it, it's like, that's killer. But at the time it was like, oh, we can't keep that. I don't think he asked Layne to sing it again. I think Toby just rolled with it. And it was like, yeah, for me, because I was sitting right next to him, I was like, Toby, that was distorted. We can't keep that. And he's like, yeah, we can and we are. That was amazing. Like, so Toby was dialed. He knew what he was doing, and he knew when a take was a take.
So, on another topic, from the time you spent with Layne, was his health deterioration noticeable over the years?
I was too young and naive to understand what any of that was. I guess now, knowing everything I've learned about, I would say maybe there was some signs later on, like, his moodiness, that might have been a sign of that. But I don't have any like direct like stories about that. I just don't know. They if anything was going on, it was totally hidden from me. But I would say he was a hell of a lot moodier and edgier and grumpier towards the later times. I absolutely observed that. And I don't, yeah, I guess it's funny now I'm talking about it. I guess it could have been drugs, but I was kind of thinking it was more like his mood around Jerry and how, because Jerry's such an intense dude and all that, It seemed like Jerry and Sean, they were like the fun hangout party guys. And Layne seemed like didn't want to be a part of that. Like Layne had his own thing. He would show up later. Like Sean and Jerry would sort of show up together, and they were always pals. And Sean was around for a lot of it. And Sean was always seemed to be kind of the prankster. But Sean had like, Sean's spirit was always, he had so much energy and so much positivity, even though it was like often sarcastic and often disgusting or humor or whatever. But he really like, his spirit there really was, I could tell, was part of the band. And I think Layne, I'm sure Layne didn't feel a part of it at that point, or he didn't want to be a part of that at that point. It was like Sean and Jerry. Mike totally fit in with Sean and Jerry. Mike was brand new to the band. I think everyone knows, Mike Inez came off tour with Ozzy Osbourne, and he was like another like amped up kind of like fun party guy. And when I say party guy, I'm not mean like drugs and alcohol. I mean like he was just down for a good time, and he was constantly in a good mood. And I think he fit in really well with Jerry and Sean. And I think Mike was really happy to be with them, and Mike knew that this was something special too. So I'd say the energy was really great. And I worked with their old bass player on the earlier stuff, Mike Starr, and that definitely was a different vibe. I think Mike at that point was kind of more in Layne's camp. Like Mike would sort of show up when he needed to show up, Mike Starr. But I think Mike Inez was more present. From my perspective, the way that their music went down, it was so casual. Like I think people would be surprised at how like lighthearted and joking and casual the atmosphere was when these songs were made. Like they're dark, heavy songs. So that is a funny thing about them, and a lot of that dark music is like, they're like a brotherhood, and it's constantly a party. And again, I don't mean party like drinking, but I mean like, it's like this locker room thing. They're just constantly joking and making fun and laughing. Yet these heavy, heavy, dark songs get born out of these people that you seem like they're like on top of the world, But clearly, it was a vehicle for them to sort of express some of the stuff that they don't show publicly, even privately, I guess. I guess I've worked on enough bands to know, like, every human has their struggles, and those guys had like more struggles than most. But when you met them, you'd never guess. Like they were like happy and funny and hilarious. So it's a funny combination, where maybe I might say like the funniest, silliest, goofiest guys, musicians were them, and they wrote some of the darkest, heaviest lyrics and songs. To me, it kind of felt like chaos. Like they wrote a lot of the songs on the spot. In fact, particularly, it was Jar of Flies, I think, was really written for the most part on the spot. That's when they had their new bass player, Mike Inez. So he was new to the band. I know they were very excited to have him there. And I know Toby, they really liked working with Toby. To me, it felt like they'd show up, they'd hang out for kind of quite a while, and then they just sort of pick up instruments, still sort of chatting and not even really focusing. And before we knew it, there was like a guitar riff. Like, whoa, that's something. You know, it took shape over time. And initially it was like, there was something there, but it wasn't a song. And it just seemed like over time, you know, within, you know, maybe the afternoon, suddenly Jerry's sort of like, oh, just let's try this and let's try this. And suddenly it was like, poof. Like, and it was almost like I didn't believe the process because it started out so raw. And I remember feeling like the songs were kind of long and like, well, what? Because there wasn't any vocals yet. You know, it was just guitar riffs and bass riffs and stuff like that. And it's like, I mean, that seems like a good idea, but I don't see that being a song. But like the next day they'd come in and bring Layne in and suddenly, you know, Layne's melodies married with these guitar parts. So it felt really chaotic. It didn't feel like there was a huge, particularly on Jar of Flies, it didn't feel like there was a huge game plan. And they feel like they just sort of stumbled into songs. But now I know like Jerry's level of like creativity and brilliance was just, you know, could really make songs out of, you just pull them out of the air and they were there. You know, I've worked with many artists that, you know, they have to work really, really hard at it. And I'm sure Jerry worked really hard at it too. But at the same time, it seemed like it just came to him. You know, he just would pick up a guitar, play something weird and make a song out of it. Jar of Flies was all about that. It was like throw a guitar in Jerry's hand and capture it, or throw a microphone in front of Layne and capture it. It all happened, you know? And again, like that's why it felt, for me on observing it, it was like, this is not how records are made, because to me, they did not know what they were doing, but every step of the way was like, it kept getting better. It kept making more and more sense. It was like me witnessing, you know, professionals for the first time, you know, like, wow, they do know what they're doing, even though it was so casual, you know, cause they're funny guys. They're kind of guys that like, they're constantly making fun of each other and poking, you know, it's a bit of that locker room thing. I mean, that's the studio world in general has that locker room vibe. But then especially it was like really like hardcore locker room talk where it's snapping towels. But it was like, you know, rock guys. It was like a ridiculous hang all the time. Everybody's funny and they're talking smack about everybody. And while this is all happening, they're playing and suddenly songs form out of this. So it does feel kind of funny where the time that they spent in the studio, it would go between hilarity, total like these really disgusting conversations about anything. I didn't like it, but at the same time, it was like Allison Chain. So I was like, whatever, you know? So yeah, it felt kind of like this just fun party train, chaotic party train that songs just sort of popped out.
So when it comes to Jar of Flies, one of the marquee songs is No Excuses. Do you remember working on that track in particular?
Jerry sat in the booth and was like, strum some chords, here's a song idea. And literally like he played it all the way through and there was no edit. This was like pre-Pro Tools. So Jerry on his own, maybe with a click track, maybe not, played through the song on his own. And Mike picked up a bass and played like that was the first thing that came out was that bass line. And then I think later Sean went in with the drums and did that like really cool drum part. And I don't know that they played it live together. I think Jerry laid it down first and I think Sean played along to it. I feel like on the Jar of Flies, a lot of times it was Jerry playing by himself first and then they layered on top of Jerry. Like Jerry was the rhythm section. And I kind of hate saying that because I like to think of the grunge era, most of those, there was such a live performance thing, but I think that record was not really a live performance thing. It was more kind of pieced together. I believe the earlier stuff, they were like, certainly like Facelift and stuff, I know they were playing live.
What about SAP? Was that live too?
I came in later, so I'm not sure. I came in after most of the stuff was tracked, so I'm not sure. But traditionally, like at London Bridge and all of my mentors and everything, we really focused on live performance.
Over the course of the years you worked with them, did they develop as a band significantly in terms of how they performed in studio, or were things always relatively the same?
Yeah, I guess the biggest difference maybe that I saw was that they were writing in the studio, where I imagine, you know, I know Facelift, like that stuff those songs had already been written, you know, way before they went into production, where Facelift, or Jar of Flies was just like on the spot. And I think the record after that was more or less written like that as well. That's pretty ballsy, you know, like, I think for Jar of Flies, like no one really knew what, I don't think Jerry knew what it was going to be. It was just like they booked like a couple weeks of studio time and like they showed up with nothing, but they're just, he's so brilliant, they came out with gold. What seemed striking to me was how out of this sort of goofiness came such like heavy music. That's maybe what struck me. And I guess I recognize that Jerry, you can see and sense, again, all the four people in the band, all the dynamics. You can when I was very, very young, I didn't understand it, but you can feel it. When you're sitting in these sessions, you can just feel the dynamics of the relationships with these people. It's like palpable in the room, and you can see when people are uncomfortable or frustrated. So I think, with Jerry and Sean, there's like an intense brotherhood there, but they also bicker too. They fight like brothers. So I guess I would see them fighting, but they seem to be, they would work through it, where Layne was really outside of that. Like Layne was, he just didn't partake in that.
Considering they were good friends, was there actually tension between Layne and Jerry?
Well, again, it's back to that whole, the life of a band and the life of a relationship, I think everyone could relate to it as just a relationship. If you have like a best friend, or if it's your, romantic partner, if you've been with someone for a long, long time, it gets complicated. So I think at that point with Alice, they'd been best friends. They'd already been best friends for a long, long time, and it's tough, being the amount of pressure on the band and the relationship. It's really, really intense. I don't know. Hopefully fans understand this, that holding a band together, especially through like this kind of ups and downs of that success that Alice experienced, it's incredibly hard on the interpersonal level. Having to make decisions and the power struggles within the band. Like, it's so complex. And I think any band that can hold themselves together, it's like, it takes massive communication skills and massive like adulting and compromising. And it's no joke. Like, it's really, and it's funny to me because I think as an adult now, it's like knowing what it's like to really dig deep into like making conscientious decision as a group and communicating clearly and not having your feelings be hurt to the point where you can't function anymore. Like, these guys were dealing with those levels of decision making in their mid-20s. It's like, it's a miracle to me that they could stay together as long as they did and function as well. It's a miracle to me that any band can stay together through all that stuff. It's just the intensity of it. I'm sure that you feed off the success, but it's still like every day you have to make decisions. A band has to make decisions, and not everybody agrees all that. In fact, most times people don't agree. So it's like there becomes a hierarchy in the band where people, I think, eventually, if you're not the one making decisions, it's pretty easy just to kind of like be a backseat person, where I think Layne kind of tended to be more the backseat person in the band. So, you're asking if they were friends, and from what I heard, yeah, they used to be best friends, but at that point, they are fucking sick of each other. They've just been on tour for however long. It's like, they're probably the last people they want to see. It's really intense. So like, it's an interesting question. Like, were Jerry and Layne friends? Like, from my perspective in the studio, it was kind of like they were just tolerating each other, but I now understand that, it's like, you don't want to be around that person. You've been on tour with them. You've been in a bus with them for, years. It's like, it's the last person on your own time. You don't want to hang out with your bandmates, At least Layne and Jerry, I imagine, didn't. But Sean and Jerry, Sean and Jerry were special. I don't think Jerry didn't like Layne. I just think the relationship just gets so complicated and so intense, between touring, spending time together, and then the creative process. I don't think it's fair to say that they didn't respect each other or like each other. I just think out of being a professional, it's like you get to that place where, you're in a room together and it's not really the person you want to see, and I'm sure, I've heard them talk about like they're brothers. It's a total brotherhood. There's so many things go unsaid, like you can get in a room with each other and not even say hi, but they just know, they know it's all cool. I think they were operating at that. I think any band that's been together for that long, you operate at that level. You think about like Steven Tyler and Joe Perry or whoever. It's like they've been with each other for, Yeah. They don't need you. You're way beyond like the pleasantries. So I'm sure Jerry had a ton of, admiration and respect and for Layne, without a doubt.
You mentioned earlier that particularly during SAP, Layne would chill in the studio and Jerry would call the shots. Did that cause any friction between the two of them, or were they good?
From my perspective, being a studio, when they came in, they had already obviously established their working relationship. And it's funny now being sort of like more of an adult and experiencing life a lot more. You kind of, in those instances, you can sense the fumes in the band, like all the dynamics between everybody, because it's a family, right? And it's like any relationship, it's a very complex relationship between all the band members. And they had a working thing that worked, and it was like unspoken, but really it was like Layne knew to just stay out of the way for the most part. Either he didn't want to be part of it, or it all seemed really smooth to me. But they had already worked it out. Like I feel like they probably had maybe years ago before that kind of worked out who's how they work best. Every band has to confront that, and it's a constant power struggle. So like, was it easy for them? I never saw them fighting, but I just know from how bands work, it's a constant struggle, because everybody is passionate and cares about it. And, they're spending all day thinking about how they want the process to go. And each band member has their own idea. And obviously Jerry was very, very strong in his opinions and his creativity. And Layne was too. So I can only imagine that they'd been butting heads for years, So I think at that point, Layne was just like, man, I know it's just to give Jerry this time and space, So yeah, it seemed like they were very seasoned at that point. By the time I was working with them on SAP, they were seasoned, and they knew how to be in the studio, and they knew how to be productive in the studio. It wasn't like they were new at this, they knew what they were doing.
Interesting. So a lot of times, not just with bands, but with people in general, when they're in their work environment, they may be more intense, so to speak, than when they're not working. Did you ever get to see the guys outside the studio? And if you did, were they more mellow? Like, did they carry themselves differently?
That's a great question. A little bit. I saw Jerry a little bit, because Jerry was pretty social. So there was a club in Seattle. It's closed now. It's called the Brick Street. It was just a scene. So I'd hung out a little bit with Jerry, and he kind of always like recognized me. My impression was that he was just an intense guy. And then Layne, on the other hand, was kind of like the opposite, where Layne was a totally chill hang. And I never really saw him outside the studio, but when he was in the studio, he was super relaxed and really friendly, like super down to earth. And I remember this like left a huge impression on me. And I'm sure we've talked about this before, but when I met Layne, he was the kind of guy that would just walk in and be like, "Hey man, what's your name? And how long you worked here?" And he would share with me. I remember one day he said he had just helped his dad load some firewood in his truck. And then he would just sit on the couch and like literally watch cartoons. And I'm sure I told this story before, but he ate cereal, and he filled out the back of the cereal box. And it's just like, yeah, he was just a total pleasure and joy to hang out with. He's just funny. And so I don't know, like what was he like outside the studio? That's a really good question. I just, that's kind of the code in the studio. Like, I think when those guys would show up, they'd already, what any of the partying that they did or whatever, maybe they were hungover, but they'd always sort of show up late in the day, all at different times. And they always seemed to sort of have chaos going on in their lives, but they'd show up and hang out for quite a while and get settled, and then just pick up an instrument, and it started happening.
So in general, from your experience working with Allison Chains, were there any particular microphones that Layne preferred using, or was he not picky?
I would say on the gear wise, and you're asking if Layne had any specific, my impression was Layne, and I think everybody sort of knows this, the history was sort of Jerry was really like the overseer of everything, of Allison Chains in general, was kind of the main creative force from my perspective of when they came in the studio. It was like really Jerry was kind of overseeing everything, and Layne would really just come into the studio when he was needed. He typically just hung out on the couch. Either he just wasn't there, or he'd be hanging out on the couch watching cartoons and eating cereal, and generally stayed out of like Jerry's way during most of the creative process. So it just seemed like, okay, now it's time for vocals, bring Layne in. That's what it seemed like from my end. So Layne would just come in, and we'd have the mic set up. There was no comments, or, Layne just went into the booth and started singing. So I feel like he had no specific, care or interest in what he was singing in. The album Dirt was not recorded at London Bridge, but the song Wood was done at London Bridge, because they did all the demos for Dirt at London Bridge with Rick. And then they went and recorded with Dave Jordan in LA. But Jerry always liked the demo of Wood better. So, and I ended up working on the remix of Wood because it was never like fully mixed. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's a little bit of London Bridge. Alice story was that the song Wood was done at London Bridge originally as a demo. And the demos are now on YouTube now. You should go check them out if you haven't heard them. The demos of Dirt, and they're really, really good. Some of my favorite Layne performances are on the demos.
That's awesome. Do you know if they actually did a recording of Wood with Dave Jordan?
They did. That's a great question. I've never heard it. I know that they did because Jerry, I know, liked the demo better. So that's a good question. I'd like to hear that. I assume it's out there. I'd like to hear it. And just so you know, and like your fans know, a little bit of back production knowledge is if you listen, because Dave Jordan had just done Jane's Addiction, Nothing Shocking. He did that right before Facelift. It's the same thing with Dirt as well. But if you listen to both the first two Jane's Addiction records alongside the first two Allison Chains records, they sonically sound almost identical. Because Dave Jordan had a very specific sound, particularly his snare drum sound and the guitars. So they really live exactly in the same box as far as like production and sounds. Like the guitars are the same, just killer guitars and this giant, huge snare drum. Yeah, I always like that. And I think once you go back and listen to it, you really hear it. Like, man, like the music's really different, but the sounds are interchangeable.
So when Dirt came out, what did you think of it? Considering Wood was not produced by Dave Jordan, did you feel it stood out at all from the other songs sonically?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I had already been living with the demos. And I'm really glad they're available now because they're really cool. So my old boss, the old studio owner of London Bridge, Rick Prosher, he's the producer, passed away a few years ago, unfortunately. But so he produced Pearl Jam 10 and the Blind Melon record and Temple the Dog. And all those records are very, we talked about how Dave Jordan has a specific sound. Rick Prosher, his production had a specific sound as well. It's very natural and organic. And the big difference between like what Dave Jordan was doing was like technically it was very over the top. Like the snare drum kind of was like a little bit synthetic and massive reverb and really like sonically huge. Where I think Rick's style had a more of a natural feel. He didn't use samples. He really utilized that room at London Bridge to this big, beautiful like brick wall in this big open room. You've sat in the room. He really utilized the space in that room in a really natural way. So if you compare Wood, it sounds more like Pearl Jam 10, or it sounds more like Temple the Dog. You actually can hear, Rick was really good at creating like natural space around things. Like you can hear the room and the cymbals. In fact, specifically, the song starts with like Sean hitting these cymbals. You can hear this air around the cymbals, and that's just the room at London Bridge. And so I think when you listen to the rest of the record, Wood, it's like sonically much punchier and bigger, but it's less natural sounding. So I don't know. I mean, it's totally up to interpretation. I would love to know what you think about if you get a chance to go listen. I'd like to know what you think. I do remember there were some really kick-ass performances from Layne on the demos, and I had been living with the demos for probably like 3-4 months before I heard Dirt come out, and I remember like it sounded really like. My first impression was like, it sounded slick and huge and punchy. And then there was moments I was like, oh, they missed the mark from some of the demos on some of the, I mean, like right away, the guitars, like Dave Jordan, like no one got better guitar tones than Dave. So I immediately was like, man, those guitars are ridiculous. But I think there was some better performances from Layne on the demos.
Maybe one day someone can take the vocals from the demos and put it over top the instrumentals from Dirt.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I remember specifically the song Rooster. I mean, I don't know. I love everything that Layne did, but I remember there was a few moments that Rooster was like, it just gave me goosebumps. I remember hearing the final recording. It was like, it was really good, but it's like, I missed a couple of really cool things. And by the way, I wasn't there for the demo, so that all happened before I was there, but I wished I had been. But I know that, their process was those things were done fast, the way Rick worked and everything there. It was just, they went in, played live, maybe doubled a guitar part and did some vocals. And yeah.
That's cool. So when it came to the acoustic guitar on Nutshell, do you remember working on that?
So usually in the studio, if you're going to record acoustic guitar, you're going to put a microphone on it. Like you can plug an acoustic guitar in, they call it a DI, like a direct instrument, and there's a distinctive sound difference. So like if you plug in, like a lot of acoustic guitars will have little like pickups in it, and that's what most musicians will use live. So if you ever see someone playing live with an acoustic guitar, they almost never put a microphone on it. It's just coming off a little pickup inside the guitar, and it has a very kind of more electric sound, where when you're in the studio, you can use a microphone and that sounds more like a natural instrument. So what I saw on when they came in for Jar of Flies, they were moving so fast, and I think Jerry had probably just written the songs on acoustic guitar. The producer just plugged his acoustic guitar straight into the board, and he just sat in the control room. He never put a microphone on the acoustic guitar. And the same thing was the bass. So Mike Inez brought like this acoustic bass that had a DI, a little pickup in it. And so I think Jerry and Layne both sat in the control room, and it was almost like, let's just get these ideas down. Here, just plug this in, let's go. And you just hit record. And I kept thinking like, well, eventually they're going to go back and like get guitar amps or like at least mic the guitar up in the studio, because they were playing in the control room. And I remember thinking like, personally, like I don't like the sound of a acoustic instrument, a DI in acoustic instrument. It just sounds just electronic and fake to me a little bit. So the whole time I was thinking, well, they're going to go back and redo all this stuff. And so that's why I just thought they're just fucking around in the control room, you know? But that's what they kept. And so when you hear like the bass on that song, it's all, none of that's going through an amp. It's an acoustic bass with a pickup in it. That's all DI. And it's kind of like, that's like the worst case scenario. Like if someone was to tell me like, you got to record a record with an acoustic guitar, except it has to be all DI, I'd be like, no way, that's going to sound awful. But that's what they did, and they made it work.
So what do you think of the sound of the acoustics on Nutshell?
It worked. I mean, Toby made it work. And I think Sean, he's playing with dowels. You can hear he's playing, you know, he's not doing the big rock thing. So it's kind of softer. But I kind of wondered, I always wondered what it would have sounded like if they had like actually mic'd up the acoustic guitar and intentionally made it sound more sort of organically acoustic. Because that's kind of a weird sound. I mean, I don't know any record that's built around that specific acoustic direct sound. I mean, you just don't hear that very often. You hear it live, like live performances, you'll hear that kind of acoustic sound, but it's usually not by choice. So I don't think they did that by choice. I think it just happened, you know? Listening to it now, it's unique. It's got a bite to it. Like those acoustic guitars and the bass, it has this bite to it that it's not electric. You know, it's not really a rock record, but it does have this kind of like, it's a little not pretty, you know? It's sort of edgy and a little metallic sounding, which I think kind of bridges the gap between Allison Chains sort of being acoustic and soft, but still having that really like, you know, edge to it. You know, now that I think about it, it's really unique what they did. And I don't think it was by design. I think it just happened. It was more out of just going quickly.
That's cool. So speaking of DI, what did you think of Unplugged?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a good example of what those instruments sound like. That's maybe one of the other settings where you would hear instruments plugged in that way is those MTV Unplugged. Because Pearl Jam did it too. All those bands, like that's the sound, and it's kind of wonky. And especially, I don't know, I think we all felt that way when we saw that. It was like, well, they sound great, but we want to hear them rock out, you know? I thought they did great.
Yeah, for sure. So sticking with that DI acoustic sound, what did you think of Rotten Apple?
I mean, I could, again, like that bass tone, like that's that fucking DI bass, acoustic bass DI, which is just, I can't think of any recordings that you hear that sound exactly. So it's pretty unique. It's an acoustic place plugged in. I mean, just an acoustic bass is weird to begin with. You know, they're kind of big and they produce a lot of like low end, but it also has this kind of bitey attack. Yeah, I thought it was a really weird choice. At the time I was thinking, why, like plug in your bass, dude. Like your real electric bass. But I guess that was that was sort of the spirit of like, they wanted to do this sort of semi-acoustic thing. And yeah, I think the core, we have to hear it again, but I think that the bass is acoustic guitar, and then they added electrics. And then, you know, he's using that voice box in that song. I think he had to call somebody to get him to send the voice box, and just so people know what the voice box is. It's a little box you literally plug into your amp, or goes out of your guitar amp into this box, and then out of the box is this like medical tube. It's like this tubing, and you put that tube in your mouth. And basically what this little box is an amplifier that pushes all the guitar sound out through the tube. And so you put the tube in your mouth, and it's very, very loud. You make shapes with your mouth, and it bends the sound. At that point, you're like a singer. So then you get in front of a microphone and you basically sing, but you don't actually make you don't make sound with your voice. You're shooting the guitar tone into your mouth and changing the shape of your mouth.
That's cool. So in Rotten Apple, Jerry is using a voice box on an acoustic guitar?
Yeah.
So were you there the days during the SAP sessions when Chris Cornell and Mark Arm came in?
I wasn't there for that. I wish I had. I'd never worked with Chris Cornell, and that's the one, like, I was around so much of that, but I never met Chris Cornell, and I never worked with him, and I'm super bummed about that.
I hear you. So Ann Wilson from Heart also appears on SAP. I know at one point she was upset with Sean Kinney because of a joke he made. Like, what exactly happened there?
Sean asked Rick to ask Anne to say Barracuda at the end of the song that they were working on. And Rick was like, no, I'm not going to ask her that. And I think Rick said, man, if you want to ask her, and we had like a remote control talk back, and he handed the remote control to Sean, and Sean got on the remote and said, hey, Anne, will you say Barracuda at the end of the song or sing it? And Anne just like took her headphones off and walked back into the control booth, and then gave him this giant lecture on what it's going to be like in 10 years when they're singing Man in the Box, you know, or 20 years when they're singing Man in the Box, and how they're going to feel about it. And it was an interesting moment of like kind of that mentorship playing out, you know. And it was funny because Sean was just like the Sean Kenny. He was just like a little child, you know. It's like, ooh, get her to sing Barracuda. Like I could totally, as like a 14-year-old fan, like that's something you might ask, because it was just so like out of, it was just a stupid thing to ask, you know, basically. But he didn't care. He just asked it.
That's funny. After that happened, was everything okay, or was there some tension?
No, it was totally cool. I mean, Anne just shut them down, you know, like I think they had massive like respect for Anne. Like I felt like, you know, at that point I was just like, for me, like they were all just giant rock stars. I couldn't even believe I was in the room with them. But I think, you know, Alice guys really looked up to Hart. I mean, who wouldn't, you know? And I think Hart recognized, you know, how amazing and knew, you know, Allison Chains was, and Hart, you know, they knew that this was a new thing. So there was like massive mutual respect there. Yeah. So it wasn't a thing at all. But, you know, Anne, obviously she just knew. She was like, no. You know, Hart was just really supportive. The Hart was supportive of the Seattle music scene in general. So when the grunge things started happening, I think a lot of those bands kind of like leaned on Hart a little bit for like navigating the music business and all that stuff. And I know Anne really liked Alice in Chains and liked Jerry, and I've heard that they even, I think at one point, like lent them money to help them make a demo or something. So they had been friends, and they just invited Anne and Nancy up to sing. So Nancy was on that as well. So they came up and sang on a couple songs. And again, it was the same thing where like there was no parts really written. They just came up and it was just an idea, you know? And so I think the girls just worked out harmonies right on the spot. And I watched that happening. And so that was the story, was that, well, a few things happened. One, Jerry and probably Sean, no, for sure, Sean and Jerry were both in the control room with me, and Rick Parasher was producing, and Anne and Nancy were in the main room recording. And they might have even been on one microphone together and doing harmonies. And a couple things. There was one time, so Rick, my old boss, you know, the producer, he's very professional and always on his game. And this is back with the analog tape, you know, it wasn't with the computer. And so you have to be really careful with analog tape because you can't erase stuff. You can't undo anything. There's no undo. Everything's permanent. So I was watching Rick. Rick was operating the tape at the time. We're normally like, he would let me operate the tape a lot of times, but for more like high intense moments, he would like knock me out and run the tape deck. So he's controlling the tape deck and recording the girls. And I remember at one point, he was so transfixed. We all were transfixed on Anne and Nancy on their singing and their harmonies, that he forgot to ungauge the recording and it erased a handful of stuff that came out after that point. I remember he had to stop and apologize, and they had to go back and redo something. That's kind of like a pretty big no-no in the industry. Like you don't erase, you know, performances. I mean, if it was me, I would have been completely mortified, but Rick was like, oh, you know, I'm sorry girls. And he got away with it. But it was kind of that moment we were like so blown away by listening to their harmonies and listening to their sing that he just lost time and space.
So is there any one Alice in Chains song that has a special meaning for you personally?
I love so much of their stuff. I would say the one thing about Alice that I still like look up to and are in awe of is their harmonies. And a lot of that was Jerry, a lot of that was Layne, a lot of it was Rick, who I know taught them a lot about harmonies. But I think it's the song, As of Now, I Bet You've Got Me Wrong. I don't know, what's the name of that song?
I think it's called Got Me Wrong.
Got Me Wrong, yeah. I just love that song. If you listen to the structure, like musically, if you listen to the structure of that song, there's so much going on. Like this is not like a simple rock song. You know, there's harmonically, there's so much complexity going on. And that's what kind of astounds me is like Jerry was so casual and goofy and party guy. He'd pick up a guitar and he'd play this complex stuff. And he doesn't really talk about, I don't hear him talking too much about music theory on the blogs or any of that stuff, but he knew what he was doing. And it's not simple. And I don't know where he learned to do this stuff or whatever. It was just the gift that he had. But I think that's a really great example of the complexity of like, there's like, you know, it's Brian Wilson stuff from the Beach Boys. You know, he's on that level of creating melodies that are extraordinary, you know, and it's like I said, especially the harmonies, like it's its own thing. Like if you look at Alice in Chains and you look at just the harmonies alone, like there's a whole world there just in the vocal harmonies between Jerry and Layne. And that's what I love about the band, and any of those songs where you're hearing the two of them sing together, it's just pure magic to me.
You know, what's interesting is Got Me Wrong is on SAP, the first record you worked on. Did you work on that song in particular?
I think I was part of mixing it. I think it was already done. Maybe we might have added a tambourine or something, but yeah, I think I helped Rick mix that song. But again, I was like 19. I think that was probably within my first like month of working at the studio.
So, in addition to Alice in Chains, another band you work with at London Bridge Studios is Pearl Jam. How would you compare Layne Staley and Eddie Vedder as vocalists?
My era of working with them, again, this was the early 90s, and they were way in different places, you know, because Layne and Alice had been a band for much, much longer, and I think had much more experience at that point than, you know, Eddie did with Pearl Jam. I think Pearl Jam Stone and Jeff had a lot of recording experience, but I don't think Eddie did. So I think when I worked with them in the early 90s, Eddie was kind of a newbie. I started seeing the very beginnings of Eddie starting to like break out more. But at that point, he was just there doing his job. He showed up and he wanted to do good and please everybody. So again, it was like he was in a different place in his career. He was, I think, still learning sort of the ropes of how recording goes. And his voice sounded amazing, but he wasn't like a performer like Layne. He couldn't, he could project and get that emotion, but technically, like, it wasn't always in key. Where I think Layne, at that era, in the early 90s, Layne was already completely refined, you know, where I think it took Eddie another, like, decade, well, maybe not a decade, but, you know, a few more tours before his voice really got to the point where he was just on point all the time. I worked with Pearl Jam a couple times. It wasn't extensive, and it was all in the early stuff, up to, like, Dirty Frank. I worked on that, and State of Love and Trust. I was huge fans of both those bands. I guess in my opinion is both of those singers are like singing straight from the soul, and you feel it, and it's awesome. But, you know, I don't think it would hurt Eddie's feelings to say that Layne was more of a refined, you know, trained singer. You know, I just think he was. I happen to know Layne was like a student of a couple like famous Seattle vocal coaches, and I have no idea what Eddie's like vocal instructions were. But I think Eddie was much more raw, where Layne treated his voice more like an instrument, you know, where I think Eddie, there was just more of a unrefined quality to him.
Over the years listening to his recordings, do you think he's progressed as a singer?
Yes. I mean, I think that's sort of the arc of singers as they get better. I think there was a rawness in the early stuff that I think everyone loves, you know, and as he's gotten better, but he's gotten older too, you know, it's hard to say. Those young, you know, I think the early years, it's just changed, you know. It's now he's more mature and he's singing more maturely. I think back in the early stuff, it was more unbridled, just emotional screaming, you know, basically. But it's different because I think Layne always had that. Layne could control it, you know. He could get that emotional thing, but his instrument was so refined. So he was kind of singing this raw emotion through a really refined instrument, where I think Eddie had no refined instrument. It was just like kind of chaotic, if that makes sense. I don't know. I wish I could explain that better, but I mean, I think you can hear it just you can sense that just by listening to it. You know, Eddie it was a little, I guess punk is the word. It's just more raw, you know.
Hey guys, the following is a clip from the first interview I did with Jonathan Plum.
How would you compare, I mean, they're two totally different vocalists. How would you compare Eddie Vedder to Layne Staley?
I think Eddie was still sort of finding his voice in the band. I mean, it was a new band, and my sense was he was still finding his voice in general, and he was finding his voice in the band. So I think it took more work. You know, my experience with recording Pearl Jam then was that Eddie had to do a lot of takes. We would do many takes, compile the best of, and I guess, I'm trying to think now, because I worked with them a couple times. It was all back in the day, but the second time they came back, he knew more what he wanted, and I could see that progression where he was. And I've been around enough artists, you know, like I've gotten to work with Brandi Carlile a lot over the years, and someone like her, I've worked with her when she was really young, and then I've worked with her a couple times since she's toured the world. And after they tour the world, you know, musicians, they just come back a new artist, really. So, for example, with Brandy, the last time I worked with Brandy, she just, one take, it's done. Where when I first started working with her when she was really young, it was like kind of a struggle. So that was my impression with Eddie, was that when I got to work with him, he was still figuring it out. And now later, and I know I can listen to them play live. It's like, oh, he knows exactly what he was doing now. Yeah. Where I think Layne was already there. When I worked with Layne back in the day, he already knew exactly what he was doing. And that's why he could pull off. He was doing those takes often just in one take.
So in general, from your experience, what was different about working with Pearl Jam and working with Alice in Chains?
The difference between working with Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains is I think both bands were at the same place of like making major, career decisions with their bands, because they both were launching at that time. So it was super intense for all the bands, both those bands. But Pearl Jam wasn't like, their atmosphere wasn't so like party, silly, goofy. It was much more business-like. But they didn't give me they didn't pay much more attention to me in any different way. Although I will say, Mike McCready did. Mike McCready was the guy that like pulled me aside and asked me like how long I worked there, and like kind of like got to know me a little bit. So that's how it stands out to me, is like Mike McCready was like that, and Layne was like that. They were the two guys in both those bands that like actually was interested in this young kid that was there basically to get them coffee or do whatever. And from what I know about history books too, it's like that was kind of the two different bands. Pearl Jam was kind of more business minded. So it didn't seem like there wasn't like this goofy locker room vibe as much with Pearl Jam as it was with Alice in Chains. It was like it was a comedy show all the time.
So I guess Pearl Jam were more straightforward, so to speak?
They were much more professional and polite, but I wouldn't say they were any more interested in me. As again, I'm working for the studio. So when they show up to the studio, I'm the guy that they're going to see, and they're going to need stuff. They're going to need coffee. They're going to need to know where to put their amps or whatever. And what's interesting about that era of London Bridge, which is pretty unique, I guess no one really talks about this, but like most studios, even nowadays too, like if you're a big band, you go to a studio in LA, there's going to be runners, there's going to be techs, there's a whole infrastructure of how a studio is going to run. There's a ladder, there's the runner who they don't even step into the control room. They're outside of the studio, but they're there to go get food and whatever. And then there's an assistant engineer, and then there's an engineer, and there's a producer, and it's a whole hierarchy. At London Bridge, there was none of that. It was me and whoever was producing. So like when it was Toby, it was me and Toby. So I was playing all these roles. I was the runner, I was the assistant engineer. And that's kind of like in LA, that's kind of unheard of, and making, these are major label records we're making with like big budgets, but it was just Toby and I. So like if Toby needed coffee, I'd go get coffee. If Toby needed a microphone plugged in, I'd go plug that microphone in. If Toby had to take a break, I would be the one running the tape deck. So it was like really extraordinary for me because I was playing all these different roles. But it's pretty unusual. Like I could maybe imagine the band might be a little bit like frustrating for them because they're maybe used to having all this infrastructure. But at London Bridge, typically that stuff just wasn't there. But maybe that's what made the process special.
So in terms of special, aside from what we've already spoken about, do you have any special memories from your time working with either Pearl Jam or Alice in Chains?
I do have a really funny Mike Starr story. So actually, this is one of the first things, I think, my very first encounter with Alice in Chains with Mike Starr. And this was SAP. So they'd already recorded most of the parts. And I didn't know anything. I just was there, And Mike Starr shows up, and it was just Mike and I. And I remember, I think I helped him get his bass set up a little bit. And I was like, well, what are we doing today? And he's like, well, I got to play bass on a song that Jerry played bass on. And Jerry did a killer job. I'm totally happy with the bass part. But my mom, I know my mom's going to know that I didn't play bass on that, and she's going to be pissed. And so I just, for my mom's sake, I got to go back and re-record the bass part myself. So he basically replaced what Jerry, it was the same bass part, but Mike Starr just played it himself. And he explained it to me that like he was going to be guilty because his mom would find out. I just thought that was really funny.
That's hilarious. That's so cool.
But Mike Starr seemed to be, he was kind of like within the party kind of atmosphere as well.
And what about Sean Kinney? How was he like?
He was awesome. He was hilarious, and he'd walk in, he was just like a hurricane, Sean was great. Really fun. But again, like from my perspective now, he wasn't like someone that really like got to know me. He just was funny. He was like a comedian, It was basically like hanging out with like a stand-up comedian all day long.
So If I may ask, when you first heard the news of Layne's death, having worked with him several times over the years and knowing him personally, how did it impact you?
I mean, I guess I felt, I mean, I guess I was pissed. I was like, fuck. We were always, at that time period, we were really busy in the studio making records and doing other things that were really exciting. And I remember I maybe just didn't really have a lot of time to process it then, because I was still working with Rick, still making records. It was still really, really exciting. And it seemed like the scene was advancing, and I was still working on exciting stuff. And it took me, I guess it sort of took me years to sort of process, like, damn, what a loss, you know? At the time, I was just sort of moving on and going. It was like, what a loss to the community and what he could have done in the world and for himself and the band and the fans, all that stuff. You know, when Kurt died and Layne died, it was just like, what the fuck?
Yeah, I hear you. So in general, what does your experience with the band mean for you?
You know, it's funny, as history plays out, I didn't think of my experience as being part of history at the time. I knew it was fucking cool. Like, I was, 19, 20 years old and kind of a shy introvert, and suddenly got placed in this room with Allison Chains. I'm like, and I'm not cool. Like, I was never like the cool kid or anything like that. I was kind of a quiet, sort of nerdy kid that was really interested in music and recording. So suddenly I got played, like, I couldn't swim with those guys, they were sharks as far as I was concerned, I was just holding on. I was just trying to keep people happy and out of the way. For my friends, personal friends, it was like, I was calling them and be like, dude, I'm working with Allison Chains today, and like all my friends, we all loved it. It was like all of my friends' favorite band. So like socially for me, like that was huge. We're just all my friends are just out of high school going to college. No one knows what they want to do. And I am recording Allison Chains. It was really special, but it was also kind of painful too, because I didn't feel comfortable in my skin. I didn't feel cool around them. So yeah, it's kind of complicated. I wish I had documented more of it. I think everybody wished we all had documented more of it, because it was such a special time. And it just kind of, all of it was born out of chaos and craziness, and poof, there it was, this music that circulated the globe and impacted millions of people's lives. So it's incredible. To be a part of that is, I feel endlessly blessed to be, even like a second of it.
So your relationship with Allison Chains, of course, started at London Bridge Studios. In general, how did you end up working at that studio?
I think it was Allison Chains. I'd heard Allison Chains. I had the record. I looked at the back. It said London Bridge Studio in Seattle. Like, this is before the internet or any of that stuff. I was like, whoa, that was done here in Seattle, this place called London Bridge. I don't know anything about it, but it sounded really cool. And then Temple the Dog came out. And I remember, like, the sound of that record was just like, what the hell? And again, I bought the record. I saw on the back was London Bridge Studio. I was like, that place. What is going on with that place? I found myself working in a couple different studios. I ended up working at a guy's studio that was good friends with Don Gilmore, who was an engineer at London Bridge. And one day I got to go to the studio with this my buddy had to pick something up there, but I got to see the studio. I was like in and out, but it was like, blew my mind, like seeing the space. So I was aware of it then. And then later on, I guess through that, so again, I worked briefly for this other studio, a very small studio, who was friends with someone at London Bridge. He told me that they were looking for an assistant engineer. And at that point, I think I had 2 or 3 people that were friends with Rick or Raj or someone at London Bridge, enough to like know they were looking for an assistant engineer. And somebody got me an application. Like, it was a written application that they had made, London Bridge had generated. And I filled it out and I mailed it back. And I believe I called Rick too. I can't remember, but I got a call from Rick Parasher, who was the owner and the producer, and set up in a personal interview. And I met him at the studio and I got the job. I was still in college. I was going to Shoreline Community College. I was going to local community college at the time. And I was 2.5 years into college, maybe not even 2.5. It was like 2, and I'd started a quarter. And I was working at London Bridge, recording Pearl Jam, and they would start around 11. I'd have to go to class in the morning. And I remember I'd have to like get out of class early to get to the studio on time. And I was recording Pearl Jam, and I was like, do I really need to be in college? Like, I'm not getting enough sleep. And so like, I just dropped out.